Hello and welcome everybody to the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara's September 2021 meeting. My name is Judy Flattery and I'm the president of the society. So I want to get right into our featured speaker for the day, Dr. Ann Taves from UCSB. She's a professor emerita in the religious studies and the principal investigator of the Inventory of Non-Ordinary Experiences project. I didn't know any such project existed. So for almost 30 years, she's been studying unusual experiences that some people consider mystical, religious, and/or paranormal. We know quite a bit about how religious people might think about those kinds of experiences when they have them. But what about humanists and people who are neither religious nor spiritual? How do they think about and explain what's happened to them? So with that introduction, Ann, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. And as I mentioned just a little bit ago, I decided to do this as a talk rather than a more formal presentation with slides, but pretty much everything I'm talking about I have done in that more formal way with slides and stuff before. So I do have some that if the Q&A goes in those directions, I can pull some of those up for you. I just want to start with something that I'm sure you're aware of, which is that those who profess no religious belief, the people that sociologists have nicknamed as nones, N-O-N-E-S, are the fastest growing demographic, sometimes referred to as fast growing religious demographic in the United States, having increased over the last decade or so from about 17% of the population to 26% here in the US. And of the non-religious, I think it's fair to say that humanists are the most self-conscious and well-organized of the nones. When in my comparing religions and other worldviews class, when I wanted to get a group that was similarly self-reflective, I had to turn to humanists as the group that I could actually compare to others, because as far as I'm able to tell, only a small percentage of secular non-believers know about or actually identify as humanists. I had to clue my atheist brother in that there was something he could say about himself on a dating website besides calling himself an atheist, which he figured would turn, potential partners off. I told him he could be a humanist, and he really liked that. At any rate, as a result of this growth, social scientists are taking note and putting a lot of energy into finding out what nones believe, but they haven't looked that closely at what they experience. So for many years, actually, as Judy said, many decades, my research has focused on what people experience. My particular focus has not been on everyday experience or experience in general, but on experiences that stand out for people because they seem weird or unusual or particularly significant. I've been most interested in experiences that tend to be highly contested, that people disagree about what's happening. And it's often because they involve outsized claims having to do with intervention by deities, extraordinary abilities, or psychopathology. And so these same experiences that are so highly contested often have a pronounced effect on people's lives, either positive or negative, depending on how they're interpreted. And some of the experiences that most interest me out of these contested ones are ones that you might think of as religious, mystical, or paranormal or pathological. But the first major point I want to make is that when we describe an experience in these ways, when we put those labels on it, we're already making a claim about what's really going on. So in the talk, I'm going to start by introducing two ways that we can think about experiences, what I'll refer to as the usual way, and the way that we're doing it in our survey of non-ordinary experiences. Then I'll share some preliminary findings and discuss the implications and specifically the kind of hypotheses that these are leading us to test as we gather a second round of data. So to illustrate the two ways that we can ask about experiences, I want to start by just giving you an item, a question that appears on the daily spiritual experiences scale. It simply asks respondents to either affirm or deny the statement, and I quote, "I feel God's presence," unquote. But notice, if you're being asked this question, or if you're a researcher that's trying to make sense of the answers to this question, people who say yes to "I feel God's presence" don't tell us anything about how they feel God's presence or how they know that God is present. We would have the same problem with a question in this format if we substituted a reference to some other kind of supernatural being, to a ghost, an apparition, or an evil presence. But if we look at some actual examples, and I'm going to give you some from both famous and not so famous people who claim to experience the presence of a supernatural being, we find that they associate these presences with a wide range of bodily sensations. So for example, to go for one of the famous ones, in the book of Acts, we hear that when, well, he was first called Saul, but Paul, who you would have heard of as an apostle, but before he was an apostle, he had an experience in which the book of Acts tells us a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And he entered then, he says, into a dialogue with the voice who identified himself as Jesus. For 3 days after this, the account says he was blind and neither ate nor drank. So the tradition claims that this was his conversion experience, but we can imagine that, well, we know, first of all, from the account itself, that those who were with him were speechless in response to what was going on. And it's a little hard, I mean, it's not hard to imagine that they had trouble interpreting what was going on. We find similar kinds of experiences reported by Catholics. A number have claimed that the Virgin Mary has appeared to them and engaged in dialogues with, and that they have engaged in dialogues with her. And there's pilgrimage sites such as Lourdes in France that commemorate these appearances and have holy water that you can use to reportedly be healed. That comes from the spring where the visionary claimed to have seen Mary. But people link other bodily sensations with the presence of supernatural agents besides seeing visions and hearing voices. When the Methodist founder John Wesley felt his heart strangely warmed, as he put it, he attributed that feeling to the Holy Spirit and counted that as a conversion experience. Charles Finney, a leading 19th century revival preacher, who's well known to historians of American religion, did the same thing when he felt waves and waves of liquid love, unquote, coursing through his body. But we don't need to just focus on Christians to see more examples of this. When Michael Harner, the anthropologist who has promoted a modern revival of shamanism, a neo-shamanistic movement, when he has visionary experiences under the influence of ayahuasca, he claims that he is in communication with the spirit world. When Robert Monroe, whose reports on experiences in which people feel as if they leave their bodies and journey to astral planes and report on things that they couldn't otherwise have known, he claims they possess paranormal abilities. And when ordinary people sense the presence of dead loved ones after someone that they've been deeply connected to dies, which is a pretty common experience, actually. This is the most common experience of presences that people feel. They often view this as evidence that the dead are still, in some sense, alive. So for almost 2 decades, I wrote and taught and lectured on these sorts of experiences on my own, like most professors do in the humanities. As a historian, I looked at the competing explanations that people offered in the past for experiences in which it seemed as if a non-physical agent was present. And then building on my historical research, I argued, and this was in a book that came out in 2009, I argued that we should quit studying religious experiences as if they're this definite thing, and instead study experiences that people claim are religious or mystical or paranormal, or alternatively as signs of mental disorder. And I could go on. This is basically what I'm saying, what I would call an attributional approach, where we look at the phenomenology of the experience, and then we look at the meanings that people find in these experiences, sometimes as they're happening, and that's something that we can talk about psychologically, but also after the fact as they reflect on them. And as they consult with other people, like religious leaders or psychiatrists or whomever. So then in the early teens, in the wake of starting to argue that we needed to study these kinds of experiences differently, I was working with a number of graduate students, both in religious studies and in psychology, who wanted to compare experiences across cultures and traditions and bring psychology to bear on what we learned. So we decided to form a lab group. These are very common in the sciences, but I think it was kind of an innovation for a kind of humanities lab group. And we didn't want to just compare individuals across cultures in the way that anthropologists might do, or ethnographers with interviews and individual historical individuals. We wanted to look at larger groups so that we could start to see what kind of cultural learning or learning through being immersed in traditions might affect the kinds of experiences that people had. And to do that, we had to be able to collect survey data from groups. So back in the early teens, we started looking into the existing surveys used to investigate experiences. And they fall under headings like that are devoted to studying anomalous or exceptional or extraordinary or mystical or paranormal, and also schizotypal experiences. Schizotypy is a word that the psychosis researchers use as technical jargon, but what they really mean are unusual experiences. So when we started looking at all these different scales or surveys, we started looking at the actual questions they were asking people. And one of the things that we discovered is if we just considered the sensations or bodily experiences that they were asking about, there was actually considerable overlap between surveys that made it sound like they were trying to survey different kinds of experiences. But the surveys didn't just ask people what the experiences felt like. They often built in claims, or at least hinted at the claims that they wanted to make about these experiences. Thus, as I indicated at the outset, the daily spiritual experience scale asks if people have felt God's presence. But a scale used by the psychosis researchers includes a question that they ask whether people have sensed an evil presence, even though they cannot see it. And the anomalous experience inventory asks whether people have experienced ghosts, apparitions, extraterrestrials, elves, and fairies. Not all in one question, but all of those are queried under anomalous experiences. So we weren't very happy with the way that they were building all these assumptions about these kinds of experiences into their questions. And so that was one of the main reasons we decided to create our own survey. And we spent a long time working on it. It took us several years, 3 of us working together to create the original version, which we then used to collect preliminary data in English in the US and India. Then 3 years ago, we got a grant, which allowed us to translate our inventory into Hindi and begin a process of validating it in Hindi in India and English in the US. And what that meant is we used a new method of validation in which we used short online surveys to see if people actually understood our questions in the way that we intended in both cultures. And this was particularly tricky because, as I'll explain a bit more in just a second, we had to make our questions very generic so that they didn't build in these assumptions about how people were going to interpret the experience. And so we had to make sure that they actually could see these sort of generic experiences we were describing, that they could recognize them in their own very culturally specific experiences. And so we weren't able to establish that all of our items really worked in both cultures. About half of them worked well, and about half of them we struggled or ultimately didn't even try to validate. But we've finished that process, and we've now collected new data using the validated inventory, which has about it has 42 questions on it. And that data we're still beginning to analyze. So the results some of the data that I'm going to be telling you about in a second is from that preliminary version. But to go back to the design, the inventory has 2 pretty innovative features. First of all, it distinguishes between what an experience feels like or seems like to people and what they believe about it. Putting seems like in is really important in our view, because there's a lot of people who have had experiences, for example, seeming experiences which it seems like they've left their body, but they may well be very aware of the neurological basis on which that generates those kinds of sensations. And so they may well be perfectly aware that there's a scientific explanation for that, and they haven't really traveled anywhere outside of their body. But we want to know if they've had the experience. And then if they say yes, they've had an experience that seems like this, then we want to know what they believed about it and how it affected them. So in the early version of the inventory, we asked 3 basic follow-up questions: whether they considered the experience religious or spiritual, whether the experience was positive or negative, and how over time it affected their life. In the revised final version, we've elaborated on those questions, and so now we also ask if they think that science can explain the experience they had, or if they think more with a capital M might be involved. And we ask them if they think there was a reason why it happened to them. And then we also ask if they thought a supernatural agent was involved. And the reason for that, one of the things that I think is cool about the new version, is that there's a lot of people, there's a lot of different definitions of what it means to be religious or spiritual. And some people may think that an experience is spiritual and still not believe in supernatural agents. And so we want to be able to catch those people. We want to be able to catch people, differentiate people who think they've had an experience or have had an experience that they think is spiritual, think science can explain it, think maybe it happened due to chance, and they don't think a supernatural agent was involved. So we want to be able to mix and match the reasons, or allow people to mix and match the reasons, so that we can analyze a much more complex kind of patterns of what people make of these things. The other thing that we did that is pretty unusual compared to the other surveys is we ask about a much wider range of experiences than most of the other surveys. We aren't starting out with just the experiences that we think are religious, or that we think are anomalous, or that we think are pathological, because we want to know what the people that we're studying think. So we do prioritize experiences for which people are known to offer competing explanations, and we prioritize experiences that we know some religious or spiritual traditions encourage people to cultivate. But this expands the list. So we do ask people if they've sensed a non-physical presence, but because we know that people associate non-physical agents with all sorts of bodily sensations, we also ask about our range of bodily sensations, including things like John Wesley's strangely warmed heart. And because the experiences people consider religious or spiritual don't necessarily involve agents, we ask about many other types of experiences that might not involve agents, including meaningful coincidences, deep insight, and special places. We also ask about positive and negative emotional experiences that stand out for people, such as Charles Finney's waves of liquid love, because here too, we know that these experiences are sometimes viewed as religious or spiritual. So the way that we've designed this inventory allows us to investigate 2 key questions that we can now ask in relation to non-believers. So we can ask whether non-believers report the experiences on the inventory as often as believers do. It's possible that cultivating experiences, having beliefs about experiences is going to cause people to notice some experiences more than others, and so report them more frequently. The other thing it allows us to do is look at whether appraising or interpreting an experience as a religious or spiritual experience makes a difference. Does it make positive experiences more significant or more life-changing if you think it's a religious or spiritual experience? Or conversely, if you have a really negative experience, does appraising it somehow as religious or spiritual, or connecting it to religion or spirituality, does that affect how negative the experience is? Okay, so now I'm going to tell you a couple of things that we found, and I want to caution you, and especially for people like Robert that know about the technical issues on this. I want to caution you that what I'm giving you here are some summary conclusions from the preliminary data. So we're using these more to generate hypotheses that we're going to be able to test with this data we've been collecting now with our validated inventory. But we found a couple pretty interesting takeaways from the first round of data. And in the US, we had responses from, I think it was about 840 odd respondents. And of those, almost half identified as Christians. But about a quarter, 247, identified as neither religious nor spiritual. We separated out those who were considered themselves spiritual but not religious. So our nuns, our 247 nuns, are neither religious nor spiritual. And I think the most interesting, one big takeaway we found is that there is a lot of similarity between these two groups, the nuns and the US Christians, in terms of the frequency with which they reported the experiences, the significance they attributed to them, and the effect they had on their lives. Now, notice I didn't mention on how they appraised them, whether they appraised them as religious or spiritual, because thank goodness for the validity of our inventory, most of the nuns rarely appraised any experience as religious or spiritual. So they did look like nuns. But in terms of frequency, significance, and the effect on their lives, for a lot of the experiences, we didn't see a big difference. And when we compared the top 10 most commonly reported experiences for both groups, 6 of those experiences were the same for both groups. And if you want, I can show you a little chart that gives you the numbers on this. But the main takeaway would be from that would be that although the Christians were much more likely to view these experiences as religious or spiritual than the nuns were, this didn't seem to make a big difference in terms of how these experiences, all of which in the 6 top most common experiences, if they were emotion experiences, they were positive experiences. In this case, whether they appraised them as religious or spiritual didn't seem to make a difference in how the experience affected their lives. Now, I can just give it as an example. These experiences, was that a question? Okay.
No.
Okay. These experiences ranged from things like I've experienced being absorbed in some activity to the point where I didn't notice time passing. Okay, that's a very common experience. Neither the nuns nor the Christians saw that as super significant. They didn't see it as having a very big effect on their lives. But even then, even though the Christians didn't appraise it as religious or spiritual very often, I think it was something like 14% of them appraised it as religious or spiritual. That was way more often than the nuns, who appraised it like maybe 2% of them. Okay? At the other end of the spectrum of the 6 was our item about whether or not they'd had an experience of love or compassion that stood out from all other such experiences. That both groups reported very commonly, not as commonly as absorption, and both viewed the experiences as very significant and the effects on their lives as very positive. But here too, the Christians appraised it as religious or spiritual way more often than the nuns. And in terms of love and compassion, since this is something that, love particularly, that Christians tend to valorize and cultivate as a kind of Christian experience, about half of them appraised that experience as religious or spiritual, and I think it was something like 12% of the nuns appraised it as religious or spiritual. So again, fewer nuns appraised love or compassion as religious or spiritual than the Christians appraised absorption. So there was no overlap in that appraisal, in those items. Okay. But then we organized the data differently. Then we sorted the experience based on how great an effect it had on people's lives, whether that effect was positive or negative. So we had a positive number for the positive ones, negative number for the negative ones, and we didn't, take the positive or negative part into account. We just ranked them, what had the greatest effect. And when we did that, we found an important difference between the nuns and the Christians. 3 negative emotion experiences, experiences having to do with loss, despair, and fear, all of which were phrased in the same format. I've had an experience of loss that stood out from other such losses. Same with despair, same with fear. When those negative emotion experiences had a less negative effect on the lives of the Christians than they did on the nuns. And at the same time, the Christians were more likely to view these negative experiences through a religious or spiritual lens, which seemed, and I'm interpreting the data here, which seemed to be what was moderating their effect on people's lives. So this is what I want to talk about in the last part of the talk is, okay, so what do we make of this? For me, this is a really interesting finding and something that I want to ponder with you. We could take it to mean that being religious or being a Christian is really good for you. I could argue that religious belief really matters whether it's true or not because it helps people to cope. And if I bought this interpretation, which I'm not going to buy, I could urge those of you who identify as humanists to swallow your skepticism because it will help you to cope with loss, despair, or misfortune. And there are some scholars who would make an argument very like this one that I'm not going to buy into particularly. And in doing so, they would typically be assuming that religious or spiritual interpretations help us to cope with negative events by providing a framework for making sense of them. And this builds on the view that whatever else they do, religions give people a sense of meaning and purpose in their lives. So I buy the argument that religion and spirituality provide people with a sense of meaning and purpose in life, but I don't buy that this is the only source of meaning and purpose in life, nor does that explain why positive experiences would have an equally good effect on people's lives, regardless of whether people appraise them as religious or spiritual. What we need to explain is why religion, appraising experience as religious or spiritual, seems to affect the negative experiences, but not the positive ones. So what I'm going to suggest is that I think we can make sense of this finding, this tentative finding, if we think about meaning-making processes, how we make sense of the world and what happens to us. But in contrast to the usual approach that views meaning-making as a distinctly human activity, I think that what we found makes more sense if we look at meaning-making from an evolutionary perspective. So to put it another way, most people tend to think of religions and humanism also as a worldview or belief system that we humans add to our lives to help us deal with existential questions regarding life, death, tragedy, and so on. But like some researchers who work on meaning-making processes, I think other animals have to answer certain basic life questions as well. So I think other animals have to know who they are, in a sense. They have to know what's in their environment and how to respond to the situations that confront them. In that sense, they have to make sense of the world as they experience it. They have to make meaning, but they don't do it in the explicit, reflective way that humans do at least some of the time, or that humans have the capacity to do. So what I want to suggest is that looking at meaning-making from an evolutionary perspective, from the bottom up, looking at what animals have evolved to do, rather than from a top-down belief perspective, offers a way to think about why religious and spiritual appraisals might moderate negative experiences, but without enhancing positive emotional experiences. In thinking about this some years ago when I started working on it, I found an essay by the humanist philosopher Richard Norman that some of you may be familiar with. It was an essay titled "Life Without Meaning," ending with a question mark. And in this essay, he challenges the common claim that without religion, people will live lives that are without meaning. His central point is that meaning in life is not simply a matter of beliefs, but more fundamentally about experience. He writes that this is demonstrated by the fact that even for those who have religious beliefs, which might seem to sustain them, life can come to seem meaningless despite the beliefs. And those who study meaning-making processes are well aware of this. They know that events, particularly tragic events, can challenge not only people's ability to cope with the meaning systems that work just fine for them when things were going well. They can challenge the meaning systems that worked fine for them when things were going well, but their meaning system may not work well in the face of tragedy. So religious and spiritual worldviews may sustain people when faced by negative events, but then again, they might not, and they may need to be rethought. So Norman suggests that for humanists, the fundamental question is not what is the meaning of life, but what makes life meaningful. And he goes on to identify 4 aspects of everyday life that make our lives meaningful. And I would argue that these are 4 foundational aspects of life for everybody, not just humanists. So the 4 are: 1, being connected to the natural world and other living things. 2, being rooted in human community with an ongoing history in which we share. 3, having more intimate emotional relationships and attachments. And 4, being at home in a universe which dwarfs our mundane concerns. But the thing I want you to notice about these four things is that they don't necessarily involve reflective thought or even language. This is why I think we can extend Norman's point to other animals who must also make sense of their environment and thus, in a rudimentary way, make meaning in order to function. So if we view meaning making this broadly, we can think about why we make meaning and what evolved capacities lie at the heart of the meaning making process. So I would suggest from an evolutionary perspective, meaning making is bound up with goal-directed action. And that when we compare actions of humans with other animals, when we do that, we may often think of our own actions in terms of our conscious goals and those other animals in terms of mere instincts. But if we think about it, we all the time perform many actions without consciously thinking about our goals. And these more automatic actions are still goal-directed. So for example, we eat because we're hungry, and more globally because we want to survive. Our goal of surviving is present, whether or not we think about it when we eat. And we can infer other animals' implicit purpose from their goal-directed action. So we can refer to the meaning of an animal's actions in light of this implicit purpose without suggesting that an animal feels a sense of meaning or purpose apart from the action itself. The animal's doing something. It probably doesn't have the ability to think about what it's doing, but its actions are based on a certain degree of evolved fit between it and its environment that allows it to respond successfully and purposefully to a wide range of events. So if we return to Norman's four features of everyday life that make our lives meaningful, we can think about them in relation to other animals as well as ourselves. So his first one about being connected to the natural world and other living things. Other animals are most certainly connected to the natural world and other living things. Being rooted in a human community and with an ongoing history in which we share, we can reword that to say that other social species are definitely rooted in communities with histories in which they share, but unknowingly. They're not aware of sharing a history. And in terms of intimate emotional relationships and attachments, most mammals have intimate emotional relationships and attachments with their offspring, and some species, such as wolves and elephants, maintain family ties throughout their lives. The fourth one, being at home in a universe which dwarfs our mundane concerns. If that is premised on actively worrying about the meaning of life, then I think this one might be limited to humans alone. But there may be ways to think about it in which animals can do that too, but I haven't come up with that yet. Anyway, this begins to suggest an answer to why religious or spiritual appraisals might matter more for negative experiences than for positive ones. Positive experiences viewed in this way are inherently meaningful. It's negative experiences that disrupt that meaning. So my suspicion is that when people are looking at meaning-making processes from a top-down perspective, based on, these belief systems that we think we have to believe in to have meaning, they miss this possibility. So in order to consciously reflect on the meaning of things, we obviously need language and various metacognitive abilities to think about things. Philosophers, theologians, and maybe even humanists spend a lot of time using their distinctively human abilities to reflect systematically on these big existential questions of meaning. But I think that this kind of reflection is more the exception than the rule. I think that when we have a sense of purpose rooted in our goal-directed actions, we generally experience life as meaningful without reflecting on the fact or trying to express why we feel it's meaningful. I think it's when this sense of purpose or direction crumbles, when we feel uncertain, when we lose our sense of direction, when we feel there's no point in going on, that's when life feels meaningless. So I think that this sense of confusion or pointlessness or lack of purpose is a feeling. It's not a thought or a belief. And I think that's what Norman was trying to point out to us. And it means that conscious reflective meaning making, the search for meaning, is a response to a feeling. So getting here to what we can draw from this, it suggests, but generally speaking, it's the disruption of connections to the natural world, to the social group, and to others with whom we have emotional bonds and attachments that leads to distress, not only in humans, but probably in other animals. And if this were the case, it would lead me to make certain predictions about what we'll find in our more recent round of data. It would lead me to expect that experiences that connect people to the natural world and to other living things will be inherently meaningful to people, whether they interpret them in religious or spiritual terms or not. I would expect this to be the same, to hold true for experiences that give rise to a sense of being at home in the universe, experiences such as awe, and experiences that connect people with others. They too, I think, or I expect, would likely be inherently meaningful, regardless of whether they're praised as religious or spiritual. So that I would predict that it's the negative experiences, experiences that disrupt our ties to the natural world, to other people, and to a universe in which we feel at home. When our ties are disrupted by natural disasters, by war, by death, by pandemics, that this baseline experience of meaningfulness is more likely to be challenged. In other words, I think it's not just or even primarily our beliefs about the existence or non-existence of gods or a supernatural realm that make life meaningful. It's a set of connections to others and the natural world and our place in it. There are scholars who think of religions as encompassing believing, belonging, bonding, and behaving. And those scholars, I think, capture much of what Norman views as making life meaningful. But believing doesn't have to be defined in terms of belief in and connection to external, transcendent beings. What the, sociologists or psychologists refer to as vertical transcendence. Being at home in a universe that dwarfs our mundane concerns can be viewed as an expression of what some other scholars have called horizontal transcendence. And that kind of transcendence is equally open to those who do not believe in supernatural agents. So in conclusion, let me return now to that tentative finding that when people appraise negative experiences as religious or spiritual, they tend to have a less negative effect on their lives, and consider two possible interpretations. First of all, it could mean, as I suggested at the outset, that appraising a negative experience as religious or spiritual mitigates its effect by placing it within a belief system that offers an explanation for why the negative experience happened, or provides an explanation of what can be learned from it that makes it seem more meaningful. But I think most of us are aware of how unsatisfying explanations such as it was God's will can be even for religious people. Alternatively, and this is what I think is the stronger possibility, it could mean that when people appraise an experience as religious or spiritual, they may be signaling that they are embedding it in more than a belief system. That is, they're embedding it in the sorts of things that Norman views as making life meaningful. The feedback and support of a group, intimate relations, and an overall way of looking at their place in the larger scope of things. If this latter interpretive option bears out, then the effect of negative experiences may be greater for non-believers if, in rejecting religion or growing up in religious homes, they undervalue the relationships that religious communities typically generate, and thus fail to cultivate the relationships that we need as human beings to maintain our resilience in the face of negative events. I grew up in a non-religious family with parents who had broken with their Protestant upbringing. And in light of my own experience, I definitely think that non-believers can run the risk of what I would call rational family syndrome. For the most part, when my parents gave up their religious beliefs, they gave up everything else that went with it. They gave up the social relations, the sense of connection with others outside our family or their work. And they gave up a context in which to think about the big questions in a secular or humanistic way. In any way, including that. They didn't replace church going with some other form of social or community involvement. It was as if my scientifically minded family thought reason and reflection were enough to get us through life. My sense is that approach works reasonably well, in solid, intact families, as long as things are going well. But as Norman suggests, I think that as human animals, we need more to find life meaningful in the face of negative experiences. I suspect that those who do not look at negative emotional experiences through a religious or spiritual lens may have given up more than just belief when they left religion or rejected religion, and perhaps haven't worked or realized the importance of working to building secular equivalents of the sort that Norman's suggesting are so critical to us as human beings.
I'll moderate. Jonathan, you have a question?
Yeah, hi. I love it. I was thinking about this ability to absorb negative experience in religious people. I would tend to attribute that to the optimism, can-do, control, silver lining sermonizing that happens in churches, but also tends to saturate American civilization more than some other parts of the world. I will be very interested to see when your cross-cultural work rolls out to see if this parallels in India.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. In collecting our data in in the first round of data, because Hinduism isn't exactly, it's as much a way of life and a culture as it is what we tend to think in the West of as a religion. We couldn't separate out nuns from Hindus. So we now have added some questions in this second round so that we can get more of a sense of if they approach Hinduism from a more secular mindset, a more naturalistic mindset, and see their dharma in more naturalistic terms. And so we may be able to get at just the sort of question that the possibility that you're talking about. But we had to make some refinements to do that.
Right. Well, questionnaires will sometimes have two boxes, either you're in or out, but real human experience doesn't fall like that.
Right. And that is so much of what we've been trying to cope with and to escape the boxes that certain kinds of definitions that we're used to in the West lock us into. So there's really an exploratory dimension to all this.
Well, I did have one other item, but these 840 odd participants, how odd were they? Sorry, I just.
Oh, you mean the exact number or
no,
what was?
No, I was making a pun about the word odd.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you didn't control for serious mental illness, did you?
No, actually. And in the early version, we didn't have a way to tell if they thought, because it's possible that individuals themselves would think that they had an experience because they were crazy or depressed or whatever, right?
Right.
As well as some psychiatrists thinking they had it for that reason. But in revising, we have a set of questions that asks about their state of mind when they had it. So we ask if they were awake, whether they were asleep, between waking and asleep, asleep while dreaming, well, they had it while dreaming, not just dead asleep. But we also ask, how did we word it? Oh, I know. We spent a long time working on this one. In association with physical or mental illness. So we put in physical illness to sort of moderate the mental illness stigma issues.
Good question.
Yeah. And when we, and under the effects of drugs or alcohol.
Okay.
So when we validated the experiences, we gave them, or validated the appraisals, we gave them actual experiences and got them to say yes, took one that they said yes to, had them run through the appraisals. And so we could see the actual experience they were thinking about and how they would appraise it. And we did have some people who said, oh, I'm suffering from depression. That's why I appraised it the way I did. And so we did, yeah, and we'll be able to sort that out in a rough way.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Robert, you have a question?
Yeah, it's hard to know where to begin, but I'm curious. Do you believe that some of these experiences may be insights into some deeper true nature of reality? And do you think that some of these participants thought that?
Oh, I absolutely think some of the participants think it. We're not trying to make a judgment about that. Our primary interest is in looking at the effects of culture on people's experience and viewing, religious or spiritual traditions as a subset of cultural processes.
Okay, but there must be a very wide range of how dramatic these experiences are. So somebody might have experience sitting on a mountain.
Reactions.
Whoa. Somebody might have the experience of sitting on a mountaintop looking at some beautiful scene and just being very peaceful and kind of having this feeling of oneness. Mm-hmm. Somebody else might be in that same place and have a much more dramatic, much more transcendent, profound experience that they describe in the same terms.
Yeah. They would both say yes to, if you were describing that as experience of peace, they would both, the peace item would be have had an experience of piece that stood out from all other such experiences. So it would have to stand out both for your more modest experiencer and for your more intensive experiencer. But where they'd really differ would be on the appraisals. So they probably both experienced it, in a waking state if they're kind of meditating or sitting. But the more intensive person would probably give it a higher assessment on what's now our impact question. What impact did this experience have? The one might say somewhat, and the other might say very much. And then on the effect on their life, if it was a highly transformative experience for the deep experiencer, they would, say highly for effect on their life rather than modestly or little. And then when we get to whether they thought it was religious or spiritual, they may think either one could think it was religious or spiritual, depending on, their frame of reference. Either one could think science could explain it, but for the kind of person that you're thinking about, who's into getting in touch with what's really real, they might say that they think more is involved than science can explain. And they may or may not say that there was a reason for this beyond chance or, in terms of the options we give them. And they might or might not say some kind of supernatural agent was involved. So we would have a way, I think, to sort out the two kinds of people that you're talking about.
Okay, that's important. But I do want to follow up on the original question also, which is you've listened to a lot of these accounts. Having listened to so many of these accounts, do you ever get the feeling that any of them actually have broken through to some deeper understanding of reality?
Well, that's kind of where let me just mention a few people here, some of whom Robert knows and some of that you wouldn't know. I mean, Robert, this is where I go around this stuff with, people that are kind of like you. So, Jonathan and Schooler and I talk about these things. There's a guy in religious studies named Jeff Kripal who's totally into paranormal experiences and how scholars of religion haven't paid enough attention to paranormal experiences and how the Societies for Psychical Research was really onto stuff, and there is a really real out there, and our brains are filters and, filtering consciousness. I come out of a discipline, right, that has looked at people's beliefs about all kinds of stuff and has been pretty much not into looking at scientific explanations. So coming out of religious studies, I've wanted to look at what the science can tell us. I'm not looking for white crows. But that's me. And I sure know there's other people, and I joke with Jonathan about that. He's bringing woo-woo into psychology. I'm trying to bring science into religious studies.
Thank you. That last thing explains it well. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a comment. I've over the years done a lot of coursework with Landmark Education. Werner Erhard did the S training back in the 70s. He did the forum after that. And one of the things that they look at there and ask us to kind of try on is when you have an experience, kind of separating what is the experience in terms of body sensations, thoughts, feelings from the meaning that you assign to it. And not like as it's the truth, but can you separate those two? And what I've noticed in doing that is that when I get upset about a negative experience, it's often not the thing that happened itself, but what I have it mean. Mm-hmm. So like, my dog died last month. I've been really sad and upset about it. What happened? I had the vet come over. The dog was on the dog bed. We were petting him. The vet gave him the shot. his heart stopped, they carried the dog away. That's like the what happened. But what I have it mean is, oh, I'll never be able to pet him again. I'll never, and that makes me sad. So it's kind of like the sadness comes from the meaning that I put on the what happened. And and it doesn't always help, but I can always go back to here's the what's happened, here's what I had it mean. Oh, that's a really bad meaning. But it also opens up an opportunity to, if we are the ones creating the meaning on the experience, we could just as soon create some other meaning. You know, so I find, anyway, when I do I find them very useful just in being able to exercise that muscle of creating empowering meaning. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you're making a hugely important point, Judy. And it's one that cuts across religious and non-religious kind of systems, because, you know, I guess I first started thinking about that in relation to some of the Buddhist practices that are also, you know, they start with life is suffering or unsatisfactory as kind of a starting premise. But the practices encourage us to just sit with the feeling and note the feeling and not add the other stuff like you're talking about on top of it. And yeah, it was in that context I started to realize, oh yeah, I don't need to do this. But I found other people, what's her name? I'm blanking out on her name right now, but she's got 4 questions. And you ask yourself these 4 questions is another way to kind of disentangle those things. And my husband and I are going through this program about unwinding anxiety that is specifically using mindfulness meditation to create that same sort of gap that you're talking about. And it's also, I mean, that's the gap that we tried to build into the inventory, and that we needed to make sure people could actually recognize their experience still when we put the gap in. But
'cause we collapse them together.
exactly.
This happened, therefore it's horrible, and
Yes.
Is it what Jonathan said? Is it Byron Katie?
Yes, Byron.
Yeah,
Thank
it's
you.
very odd. I went to one of those seminars, and yeah, the idea was like some woman who had been molested as a child. She's supposed to ask, what did I do to hurt this person or something?
Yeah,
And
I mean,
I don't quite know what to do with that. Yeah.
Yeah, on the surface of it, I've listened to enough of her examples that I know what you're talking about. But on the other hand, my sense of it is that all of our questions are designed to kick us out of our usual way of thinking about it, and then start, that gives just this sort of freeing thing that Judy was thinking about. But let me just add one more thing to that, which is I think that we learn a whole lot unconsciously. In other words, the same things that you're talking about, Judy, we internalize through practices, through the groups we're involved with, through a way of life. And we're not aware of how we've internalized a way to understand our experience that in another culture may not be the same. And that's part of what we're trying to find a tool to surface, because you can't just ask people straight out about that, because we don't realize what we're doing that we've just picked up by being Americans, for example.
Yeah, what we have collapsed. Yeah,
what we've collapsed.
yeah.
I guess still a couple of comments. One, that light behind you in the ceiling makes for a nice halo.
Oh,
gives this whole thing kind of a little religious flavor. The other thing is I wish even 1% of the people that do questionnaires put half the thought that you guys do into them. I mean, it's clear that that's 90% of your job is figuring out how to ask the question. And so often you see, to see the results of these questionnaires and you look at it right away, even, me totally untrained in that, recognize, Well, they did not think about that question. And so it's refreshing to see something that's gone through the validation and, all the effort to make this useful.
Well, thank you. Part of it is, well, besides it being a good thing, we're also trying to prove to scholars in the humanities that we could actually design surveys that will get at things in a complicated enough way that they don't have to just dismiss them.
Mm.
So we're really trying to bridge the divides between some of these ways of approaching things, like in the social sciences and the humanities and all that. So, yeah.
All right, that's great. Thank you again for coming and talking to us about your research. Really appreciate it and value your partnership. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I ask people don't leave yet because we have a special treat for you. And is that the Harris family has moved to town here from Salt Lake City. Are you sharing?
I am sharing.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Welcome, Harris family, to Santa Barbara. Came here from Salt Lake City, and they are humanist celebrities, and very thrilled to have them here. Oh, there they are. And so I wanted to welcome Bailey, the older sister, Elle, the younger sister, and their dad, Doug, and invite them to introduce themselves and tell us what brought you to Santa Barbara and what you've got planned. Let's see. Go ahead.
Yes.
You're up.
All right. Well, nice to see you all. Thanks for inviting us to spend just a couple of seconds with you. We're really excited to be in Santa Barbara. Nice to meet you all. And, the girls are really the reason that we're being invited. They're the celebrities. So I'll let them introduce themselves, but just a little bit about our family. My wife and I grew up in Ventura County. After we got married, we moved to Salt Lake City, Utah, and we've been there for 20 years, the last 20 years for work. And so we're so excited to be back in Southern California with our family, and we thank you all for making us feel welcome in being here. And so, Bailey.
Oh yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Bailey. I'm the author of 3 books, and my story is pretty big, but I'll shorten it for you guys. When I was 8 years old in Utah, I was bullied pretty bad for not being in a religion, particularly being Mormon, which was the huge religion back in Utah. I was bullied by quite a few kids in my class, and I was told that I was going to hell for not believing in the Book of Mormon, and I told them that I didn't believe in Jesus. That's when I almost had these horrible thoughts of not wanting to be alive at the age of 8. There was times in the year if I wondered I just had really bad things happen to me, and so I just really struggled during the time in Utah. I was able to get some counseling, luckily, and my parents got involved with the school and were able to talk to them and sort things out. But after this experience, I wanted to come up with a book series to help children love science and learn my truth and what I believe. I was excited about this concept, and that I was so excited with this concept that I ran up to my family's computer and just started writing what became my first book. My name is Stardust, which is this one right here. And yeah, it's pretty cool. But this book led me to my activist, which I'm very passionate about lately, obviously with the changes in the world. And I'm very grateful for being able to have the books that I have. I've been able to speak all around the country with groups like FFRF, American Humanist Association, Secular Student Alliance, and I spoke with Richard Dawkins at CSICon in 2013. And I'm so excited to be living here now in Santa Barbara, and I'm actually looking really forward to meeting you all in person one day. And
Thank you, Bailey. And I think Richard Dawkins wrote the foreword to one of your books, didn't he?
yeah.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, very cool. And Elle, then you're also an author, I understand.
Yeah,
Tell us about it.
So hi, everyone. My name is Elle. I'm the author of the book Elle the Humanist and Wonderful Earth, but this is Elle the Humanist. And then, so I've watched my sister Bailey grow up as activist and always going to like places and talking about her books and her story. And I've always wanted, since I was young, I've always wanted to write a book and do that someday too. So 2 years ago, I was having conversations with my friends, and you talk about religion, and they were really supportive about my ideas and how I wasn't religious. And most people in my class were Mormon, of course, and they didn't understand that someone could be a different religion. Like my friend Penny, and Utah, she didn't even know that there was any other religions except for being Mormon, which I thought was really surprising. So I talked to her about it. And then I thought these conversations were really fun, and I liked expressing to people what I thought about it. And so I wrote this book and about these conversations that I had with my friends to share to a lot of kids who can't explain that to people, know how to. And it was so nice to meet you all, and I hope to meet you all in person someday.
Yeah, Elle, I saw you when you were a featured speaker at the Secular Student Alliance Conference last summer, and that where you read your book. And the thing I remember from your book, it's like people talk about the golden rule, treat others the way you want to be treated. And your book said, no. How about treating other people the way they want to be treated? And I'm like, oh, that's really brilliant. So, we're just so glad you guys are here in Santa Barbara, and welcome to our community. And we look forward to seeing what you're going to do next. So, and Doug, thank you for reaching out and having the girls on.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Nice to meet you.
Great. Thank you. Oh yeah, and then there's a picture of some of the books. So those of you on here who have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, birthdays coming up, holidays coming up, there's humanist books out there written by kids for kids, and so that would be great to support and get the word out. All right, I have just a couple of announcements. Upcoming events. Well, this is interesting. Anne was talking about the illusion of religious experience, the illusion of God. We have Dr. Jack Wathy back next month. He is the author of The Illusion of God's Presence. He talked to us in April of 2019. He's now on to some other items. He's now looking at narcissism. The name of his talk is Narcissism Broke Our Democracy. Can Science and Math Fix It? So that should be very interesting. And Dave, of course, sorry, I skipped over that. October 3rd, 3 p.m. is the next installment of his COVID pandemic modeling work. Which number is it?
1,000.
Yeah, it's his 1,000th presentation. I don't know.
It's way more than I expected at the beginning.
More than he expected. Yeah. He's still going strong. And we do put our the presentations up on our YouTube channel, and this one, once it's edited, will also go up there. Thank you all for attending. Thanks again, Anne, for that presentation, fabulous research, and welcome again to the Harrises. We look forward to getting to know you better.